Well, there's definitely information that they should put out there, I think. So separate connections. Yes. So Brunell is a lot more connected to Epstein in the sense of the sex trafficking case. So he and Epstein worked together on this modeling agency called MC. It's kind of my view. Yeah. So basically what I argue in my book is that the network behind Epstein and the reason, definitely information that they should put out there. So for example, the FBI raided Epstein's New York townhouse. They were reportedly binders, CDs full of multimedia content, all sorts of stuff. We don't really know what was on those. We had Pam Bondi, the attorney general, say, oh, it's on my desk, and then is saying, oh, well, we can't release it because it's all CP, it's child porn. After saying oh, no, it's implying it was releasable. But there's also a lot of strange things that would be interesting to know. Why did the FBI, even though they raided Epstein's residence in New York, why did they not raid Zorro Ranch in New Mexico, another property within the continental U.S.? Why did it take them up to a month to get to his island in the U.S. Virgin Islands? As far as I'm aware, those delays are unexplained. What about the France case? Jean-Luc Brunel, one of the main, or alleged co-conspirators of the Epstein case, died in a French prison awaiting trial, much like Epstein in 2022. And we don't really have a lot of information from French authorities about what they found as part of that investigation, because obviously with Brunel not going to trial because he died, it's not going to come out in the court, right? Also died by hanging and no surveillance footage as well? Well, I'm not sure about the circumstances of the death, but it was pretty much, it's kind of shady, yeah. There was another death related to Epstein in 2022, Mark Middleton. Yes. That was completely bonkers. Hanging and shotgun. Yeah, hanging by police say that he hung himself with an extension cord and also shot himself in the chest. Said there was no weapon at the scene, later came back and said there was a weapon 30 feet from his body. And then the judge sealed all evidence from ever being made public to stop the spread of harmful conspiracy theories. So Brunel dying in prison, I'm not really aware of the circumstances. But, Do you want to explain the connection of Brunel and Middleton to Epstein? Well, there's separate connections. Yes. So Brunel is a lot more connected to Epstein in the sense of the sex trafficking case. So he and Epstein worked together on this modeling agency called MC2, where under the guise of modeling contracts, Brunel would coax a lot of women from places like Brazil, from Eastern Europe and in Russia, among other places, to come model in the U.S. Epstein would pay for their visas, among other expenses, for this agency, and they would come to the U.S. and be housed at these apartment complexes that are there's multiple attestations to that being a key part of the sex trafficking operation. Allegedly, women's passports were taken, so they were, very controllable under those circumstances. So Brunel was a key part in that sense, and he also operated stuff out of Miami and Palm Beach. He had modeling agencies there, and he was known as far back as the 1980s to be an alleged sex trafficker and sexual predator. There was a 60 Minutes expose about him, and then an author, I think his name is Michael Gross, wrote a whole piece about a whole book about the dark side of the modeling industry, and a key focus of his work was Jean-Luc Brunel. So he's, pretty well known as being an accomplice of Epstein in court documents and beyond. And Middleton was Middleton was the main person that Epstein was meeting with when he was going to the Clinton White House in the 1990s. And he went a lot. He went 17 times between 93 and January 95, and Middleton left in February 95. So basically, there's a more or less a coinciding between the end of Epstein going to the Clinton White House and Middleton's ouster from there. Yeah. And in Middleton's suicide happened shortly after the extent of those meetings was revealed. So it was known that Epstein had been to the White House a few times, but they didn't, the full extent, the 17 meetings, most of them were with Middleton. That information came out in 2022, and a few months later, this incident with Middleton takes place.
there appears to be a lot of people connected to the Clintons who've died. I think you said in an interview I heard there was like another 34 that haven't been listed.
Oh yeah. Well, that has to do with the Commerce Department. So this is part of this broader scandal, and it's very complicated, but I try and delineate it in my book. But basically, there was this whole airliner, or this whole airplane that was carrying people from the Commerce Department, including the Secretary of Commerce, Ron Brown, and their plane, crashed in Croatia under kind of dubious circumstances. And I would argue that those were kind of. I don't really think that plane crash was an accident. And I explain why in my book. But there's lots of... Ron Brown had just agreed to testify as part of this broader case involving corruption involving the Clinton families and the scandal that Middleton, and I argue in my book, Epstein was a part of, called Chinagate. It's remembered as Chinagate, but it was definitely something much bigger than that, and we can get into that later. It's very insane. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of my view. So basically what I argue in my book is that the network behind Epstein, and the reason why there's so many powerful people in this group, is because it's born out of this union that occurred during World War II between organized crime and the nascent U.S. intelligence apparatus, which, of course, there was a lot of British involvement with that in the creation of, the CIA and the OSS and all of that in World War II. But that alliance officially happened. It's known as Operation Underworld, even though the U.S. intelligence community denied it for several decades. They now admit it. But that alliance, it was justified out of wartime necessity. We have to team up with the mob to win the war, right? But after the war, the alliance provably continued. So ultimately, what happened then is that a lot of these rackets that were previously of organized crime, arms trafficking, drugs trafficking, sex trafficking, prostitution, whatever, became, rackets of intelligence services.
In what way?
Well, I mean, there's a litany of evidence of the CIA being involved in drug trafficking and arms trafficking via illegal means. For many decades. And a lot of those networks that the CIA used go back to the same nexus. I mean, that's basically what volume 1 of my book is about.
But why would they be in bed with these criminals?
It's great business. The CIA in the OSS were really mostly Wall Street people, Wall Street lawyers and bankers. And it was great business for them to team up with these people. So basically, it's a new market. It's a illegal market with state protection. And so the CIA, more often than not, has gone over the competition for those markets. And that's why you have all these scandals, but no accountability for the CIA being involved in drug trafficking, arms trafficking, and all sorts of scandals over the years. But there's never been any accountability since, there was an effort with it at during the Church Committee in the late 70s. But since then, the CIA investigates itself and exonerates itself every time.
Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to get my head around this. So whilst the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, is meant to be protecting U.S. interests abroad,
they define U.S. interests, I think, as something than what the American public is. So if you look at the CIA's earliest coups, their earliest regime change operations, they were done on behalf of very powerful multinational corporations, like Anglo-American Oil in Iran, and the United Fruit Company in Guatemala, some of the earliest examples. So to them, protecting U.S. interests is protecting the interests not necessarily of the American people, but of massive American-based multinational corporations.
So it's all economic defense?
In a sense.
Arguably economic defense. Because wasn't the Guatemala, didn't they remove a kind of socialist leader who wanted to return land to the Guatemalans?
Yeah. Well, that historically has been the justification for a lot of it. And a lot of the justification was sort of Cold War era stuff. We don't want this leader to become close to the Soviets. Ergo, we must remove him from power. But, the means of that have been pretty scandalous, especially if you look at, what came downstream of some of those governments. In Latin America, for example, Chile being a notable example where, Henry Kissinger and the CIA in 1973 orchestrated a coup against Salvador Allende, and then Augusto Pinochet takes over. And, it's obviously a still very sore spot in Chilean politics. But objectively, there's a lot of things Pinochet did that are really indefensible. He teamed up with a German pedophile guy who ran this place called Colonia Dignidad with his government's approval. A lot of people tied to the Pinochet government were involved in basically trafficking babies that were stolen from their mothers and then sent to adoption agencies at the U.S. People made money off of this. And nothing was done. And he had a lot of really shady bank accounts, did shady arms deals. So, okay, the socialist guy is gone, but, was it really any... did it really justify all this other stuff? I mean, I'm probably going to get in trouble for getting into Chilean stuff just because, people will accuse me of defending one side or the other. But I think, obviously Pinochet engaged in behavior that was really, really bad and should,
And it's interfering with the democratic process.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, people elect a leader and then the CIA comes in and deposes them and puts in a dictator. I mean, they've done this around the world.
Over and over.
Over and over again. And I mean, it's not even, they've also interfered in elections throughout Europe. They engaged in things like Operation Gladio, where that was basically teaming up with, the Italian mafia, interests of the Vatican, and the CIA-backed terror groups in Europe. Those terrorist activities were blamed on left-leaning people in order to get people to vote with right-leaning parties to prevent European countries from affiliating themselves with, the Soviet Union. But would they have done that? I don't know. I mean, it was a preemptive thing. And so, I mean, eventually... but I mean, again, this is how the CIA justifies the stuff to itself. I would argue that a lot of it was about economic interests. And at the same time, a lot of these actors were involved in sort of backrooms deals with, either Soviet intelligence or Chinese intelligence or the Chinese military. That's sort of what the Chinagate thing ultimately circles back to. And
tell me about that.
Well, really quick, I want to bring up this point. So Samuel Pisar, a very close friend of Robert Maxwell, who I'm sure we'll get into later, he was a lawyer, among other things. He testified to Congress in the early 70s about what he saw happening, and he talked about the rise of the Trans-ideological corporation, where U.S. multinational corporations were basically entering into all these joint ventures and becoming extremely entangled with state-owned companies of the communist East in Russia and China. And he said that this was creating a new economic system of governance that was making the nation state irrelevant. And this is in the early 70s. And a congressman was like, well, do you think this is a bad thing? And he was like, not necessarily. And he was actually at the forefront of making that happen. And a lot of these people, including people like Robert Maxwell, did try and further that kind of vision. So ultimately, if that was happening at the early 70s and they admitted it, a lot of these actors that justified things out of the necessity of the Cold War, just like they justified it with out of the necessity of World War II, it really doesn't add up with what the public justification is.
Is it even possible to understand what the mandate of the CIA is then? Because it seems very...
Well, it's supposed to be to protect American national security. But national security for a long time has been this huge catch-all, right? Of
course, yeah, that's
and
what
the
I mean.
U.S. has justified all sorts of things under the guise of national security, and presumably continued to do so. So, I don't really give that a lot of weight. I mean, so as an example, like the Reagan administration, when Iran-Contra was being investigated, there was a line of questioning brought up about how the group that was responsible for that in the Reagan administration had developed something called the continuity of government protocols, whereby under a vaguely defined national emergency, basically the entire American Constitution could be suspended. Pretty scandalous stuff. And one of the examples of this vaguely defined national emergency was a widespread nonviolent opposition to U.S. military intervention abroad. And when a congressman tried to ask Oliver North about this at the Iran-Contra trial, they basically shut down the hearing. under the guise of national